everyone, this is Miss Siddiqui here. In this video we are going to continue talking about the background of the play The Crucible, and this is the part 2 background video. In this video we're going to talk specifically about the historical and social context of the play, both when it was taking place and when it was written. So when it was written was during the Cold War in America. So at the end of World War II, the US and the USSR emerged as the world's superpowers, and they became involved in the Cold War, which was a war that did not involve any military action or any direct military conflict, but was this state of hostility and competition between the two nations of who could assert themselves and who was going to end up the most dominant superpower in the world. So many Americans feared not only communism around the world, but also disloyalty at home, and were suspicious about communist infiltration into the American government. So the USSR, communist state, they were concerned that if communism infiltrated the US, that the USSR would emerge as a superpower and as a higher power than the US. So a lot of Americans thought the Soviets got the atomic bomb by using spies, and it was charged that secret agents working undercover had stolen some of our top secrets, our military secrets, and given them to the enemy. And even worse, that these spies supposedly were hardly Russians themselves, but actually American citizens who were the kind of people who you could see every day. So there was this big sense of fear. So this was called the Second Red Scare. So a communist could be anybody. It sort of makes a communist sound like the boogeyman or something, right? So it's something that everybody feared, which was kind of bogus to us now looking back, but it was a very real fear that people had. And there was a lot of propaganda, anti-communist propaganda in the 50s. So Congress investigated suspicions of disloyalty by forming the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC, or HUAC, which sought to expose communist influence in American life. And beginning in the late 1940s, this committee called witnesses to investigate specifically the entertainment industry, and prominent film directors and screenwriters who refused to cooperate were imprisoned on contempt charges. And as a result of the HUAC investigations, the entertainment industry was blacklisted, and people refused to hire artists and writers who were suspected of being communists. So you would think that entertainment has very little to do with communism and with the government, but you can see how pervasive this fear of communism was, because it was getting into other types of industries where if you were thought to be a communist, you wouldn't even be hired. So the person who headed up HUAC was Joseph McCarthy, and he was a senator from Wisconsin who gained power basically by accusing others of being communists. And in 1950, after the USSR detonated its first atomic bomb, McCarthy claimed that he had a list of 205 communists who worked at the State Department in the US. So although his accusations remained unsupported, and the Senate committee labeled the accusations as a fraud or as a hoax, McCarthy himself won a national following, and he branded the Democrats as a party of treason. He denounced political foes as soft on communism, so McCarthy was tough on communism, and he called Truman's Secretary of State a Red Dean, referring to the red of communisms. So McCarthyism came to mean false charges of disloyalty. So when we refer to this concept of McCarthyism, it's a tribute to Senator McCarthy, who headed up this witch hunt of communists. So in September 1950, goaded by McCarthy, Congress passed the McCarran International Security Act, which established a Subversive Activities Control Board to monitor communist influence in the United States. So what this means is that McCarthy's influence continued until 1954, when the Senate censored him for abusing his colleagues and his career collapsed. However, fears of subversion continued. Particular communities banned books. Teachers, academics, civil servants, and entertainers lost their jobs, and unwarranted attacks of being a communist ruined people's lives because they couldn't become employed. So, we are going to talk about the HUAC and Hollywood. So, HUAC investigated communism within Hollywood, calling a number of playwrights, directors, and actors known for left-wing views to testify, and some of these individuals were forced to testify just so they could avoid prison sentences. So there really was this kind of bargaining happening to kind of save your own skin. So a really famous group that we talk about is the Hollywood 10, which were a group of entertainers who refused to testify and thus were convicted of contempt and sentenced to 1 year in prison. So these industry workers that were called before the Senate committee to testify had three options. They could claim they were not communists and never had been of the members of the Communist Party. They could admit or claim membership and then be forced to name other members of the Communist Party, and this would mean losing their jobs and their status. Or they could refuse to answer any of the questions at all and face consequences, and this was the choice they made. So during this era of McCarthyism, over 300 entertainers were placed on a blacklist for possible communist views and were thus forbidden to work for major Hollywood studios. Arthur Miller, the author of The Crucible, was one of those blacklisted and thus was very negatively affected by communism in terms of society potentially seeing him as a communist. Now, we talked about in the previous video that Arthur Miller was still very successful. That's because his writing was incredibly powerful. So as basically a protest to what was happening to him and to his fellow entertainers, Arthur Miller wrote The Crucible. So, Miller versus McCarthyism. Miller admitted to the HUAC that he had attended meetings, but denied that he was a communist. He had attended, among others, 4 or 5 writers' meetings sponsored by the Communist Party in 1947 in New York, and because he refused to name others who associated with leftist or suspected communist groups, Miller was cited for contempt of Congress. And remember, he had only attended these meetings, and for simply not revealing others who had attended the meetings, he was cited for contempt. So in this time, even if you had no communism in your past, you could easily be in the same position as Arthur Miller. You knew someone who did, and that was enough to get you investigated by Senator McCarthy and similar investigators. So Miller wrote The Crucible not simply as a straight historical play about the Salem witch trials in the Puritan era, but he was trying to critique what was happening to him and his fellow writers during the era of McCarthyism. So actually, a good deal of the information in the play kind of represents the literal events of the Salem witch trials, but keep in mind that this play is supposed to be a parallel for the McCarthy era in terms of these are witch hunts occurring against targeted citizens, just like during the Salem witch trials, the accusations were very targeted. So though the play misrepresented the historical events of the Salem witch trials, it still seemed as very significant in terms of representing what was happening during the era of McCarthyism and kind of the sentiments and the atrocities committed during the Salem witch hunts. So another important piece for context for the play is, what does crucible even mean? So a crucible is quite literally a vessel of refractory material like porcelain that's used to melt a particular substance at a very high heat. But crucible also means a severe test and being placed in a situation in which concentrated forces interact to cause or influence change or development. So the name The Crucible could talk about the severe tests that witches were put under during the Salem witch trials. The severe test could be of the Hollywood stars accused of communism, and the Crucible could refer to the name of the play, which was supposed to incite change and see McCarthyism for what it really was, which was just a modern-day version of these witch hunts, which were really negative for society and often very fraudulent. So the title, The Crucible, really has layers of meaning, and in order to understand the play, you kind of need to know the context of this word. So hopefully that historical and social context for The Crucible will be illuminating as we start the play. Thanks for watching!